Chapter 4. Trail of Despair. Laura's body became rigid with sudden driving purpose. She clattered over the fallen door into the parlor. The fire in the hearth had died to dull, gray ashes, the boards creaked loudly underneath. But her seeking foot crunched against the flashlight Frank had dropped. She groped for it, found it. A flick of a frozen finger and a thin pencil of white light stabbed through the murk. Out into the moonless night again, flogging her numbed limbs along under the whip of her will. Hurry! Hurry! The elongated oval of luminance pierced like a pointing sword before her. She raced across the open patch, thudded with slim, high-heeled shoes over the rough, uneven ruts of the road. The woods raced with her. The trees bent down over the trail, plucked at her with slithering branches. The ground heaved and rocked unevenly with her insane flight. Unseen shapes padded stealthily through the black masses on either side, closing in on her with furtive gait. The stars gleamed wanly overhead and shed no radiance. The beam bored a tunnel of whiteness through the solid blackness, and tilted up and up. The road was climbing. The road became the trail and then a thread of forgotten hooves. The trees were giving way to stunted firs, to tangled underbrush. Superstition Mountain hulked ominously above. On and on she drove, the breath wheezing in her lungs, her heart a squeezing gout of blood. She held her eyes desperately ahead, focused on the beam that bobbed before her. She dared not look behind. That insistent sound was merely the thump of her own heart, the pounding in her own ears. But even as she clamored it to herself, she knew that it was not true. Someone, something, was following her up the trail, was even now increasing its pace. God, they were coming for her. The things that were chained, the horde which had claimed her husband. They were coming to drag her, shrieking insanely, to their Mr. Euro, he of the lash and horrible, white head. Faster and faster she fled, heedless of twining saplings up the first slope of the mountain. Behind her, loud with doom, were pantings that were not her own Euro, gusty sounds that did not issue from her throat. It seemed as if they were calling her, trying to slow down her pistoning limbs. Her fingers froze to the flash. Her lungs were bellows without any air. The thing behind was gaining. Soon it would be upon her, would. Insanity poured its gibbering turmoil into her brain. Laura did not know she was running and sobbing wildly now, did not know that even the trail was gone, that the mountain was a sky-climbing wall just ahead. One maniacal desire hammered at the confines of her skull. She must see this thing that pursued her through the night, she must laugh shrill and loud in its face. Face. Perhaps it had no face, perhaps it was an insubstantial horror, an excrescence out of hell. No matter. The desire to laugh, to shrill out her answering mockery, became an overwhelming madness. She thrust her corpse-rigid head back over her shoulder. Her features glared with impending insanity. In her delirium, she did not realize that her back was against granite now, pressing into it with numb, icy flesh. She did not see the silent shape that rose like mist of the underworld out of the solid blackness of the mountain that moved toward her without a sound, with shadowy tentacles outspread. All her shattering faculties were strained on the thing behind, still clambering and puffing up the grade. She whipped her electric torch suddenly downward, back over the trackless waste she had just climbed. The white pencil of flame flashed on a scrambling figure that jerked backward in startled fear. It held for a split instant on a swarthy, bony face, on eyes that gleamed like live, dark coals. The pursuer opened his mouth, and hoarse, strangled sounds spewed forth. Then his eyes flicked to one side of her. They went wide with desperate, grinding terror. With a great bound, he heaved out of the oval of radiance, into the blackness of the encompassing bushes. Shrill cries accompanied his sliding, plunging retreat down the rubble-covered mountainside. Laura thrust back her head and laughed. There was madness in that laughter, there were fiery worms seething in her brain. But her limbs shook and her teeth unlocked. It had been Lima Euro, the cobbler of Squam, the village atheist Euro, who had followed her, who had fled before the slash of the electric torch. She was safe now, safe to seek her husband, to get him away from the devils of the mountain. The thought of Frank chased the crawling things from her skull, brought her back to sanity. She turned to force her way upward again. As she swung around, a shadowy shape flowed over her. Suddenly she was enveloped in clinging, clammy folds. Her scream strangled in her throat, her flailing hands beat vainly against insubstantial softness. Something sickeningly sweet seeped into her consciousness. Her thoughts drifted slowly away. She tried to reach out for them, to hold them tight. Her mind tottered, fell into a bottomless pit of blackness. From far up, almost from the sky itself, came a low, snarling chuckle. There was something wrong with this place. It was true it was night and her eyes were still closed in sleep. But this was not her bedroom on the upper floor of the summer cottage. Laura stirred uneasily, moaned in her drugged daze. She thrust out a lethargic arm, as she always did when she dreamt, and the things she dreamed were frightening. The feel of Frank's firm, warm flesh, the little ridge of muscle along his shoulder blade, always comforted her, always soothed her trembling nightmare fears back to the sweet drowse of untroubled sleep. But now nothing met her questing fingers, nothing but chill, dank air and hard, damp stone. The dull ache in her head exploded into hurtling shards, the clinging, sickening embrace fled from her limbs. Her pain-heavy lids swung open, her bewildered eyes fluttered like frightened birds. A scream ached in her throat, jittered thinly through her lips. She pulled leaden limbs upright from the rocky floor on which she had been sprawled. She had not been dreaming. It was no nightmare that vanished with a touch, with the first level streamer of light through the east-facing window. Terror flooded her being anew, locked her throat tight. She glared wildly around. Where was she? Where had that shapeless thing which rose out of the depths of hell transported her? Was she dead and buried beneath whelming earth in a vaulted grave? All around, enclosing her like a living tomb, was rock and solid, curving stone. Shiny black it was, spangled with innumerable pinpoints of fire that lit up the whole round of the chamber with a ghastly, eerie light. Alive and gloating they seemed, those pinpoints, like baleful eyes mocking her whichever way she turned. The strange radiance bathed her shrinking form in a yellowish aura of flame. It seemed to flow through her silken dress, to tingle with prickling fingers against her skin. It seemed to slither into her quaking flesh, to munch with greedy, invisible mouths at her very bones. Suddenly she was afraid, unreasoningly, instinctively afraid of the ghastly, probing light which emanated from the walls. More afraid even than she had been of the madman who had heaved against her door, of the stumbling, manacled things who had been whipped through the woods. Her whole body felt unclean, her skin crawled under the impact of those strange, unholy flares. The strength seemed to ebb from her body, from her bones. They could not longer support her. Laura swayed blindly toward the nearer wall. Her smarting eyes lowered, blinking against the weird luminance. She jerked backward with a choked cry. Horror stiffened her spine, held her rigid and unmoving. There, at her very feet, lay a row of ghastly, frightful things. Things that had once been men, and now were unmentionable decay. Nude corpses from which the clothes had long since rotted, glowing in the pale, yellow glare with a terrible greenish putrescence of their own. The hard, virescent flesh was pitted and gajada, as if fanged, unhuman monsters had munched their hideous meals. The eyes were holes that yawned in fleshless, grinning skulls. The jaw bones were crusted with dull, gray powder. Corpses of men, dead for years, on whom the flesh had grown green and hard and pitted, corpses who had been carefully laid out in a grinning, dreadful row for her to see. Laura's skull squeezed like the metal cap on a condemned man's head, rivers of ice pounded through her veins, crashed sickeningly within her heart. Merciful heaven! These were the men of long ago who had dared scale the prohibited heights of Superstition Mountain, who had paid for their temerity with their lives. What demons out of hell had done this to them? What fiends had thrust them in this gruesome chamber where the very walls flayed them with unholy light? Light that pitted and burned and seared euro, and held from natural decay. Suddenly Laura knew that this was to be her fate, that she too was doomed to scrutiny from the myriad, baleful eyes hidden in the shiny, black walls. She knew that she too would soon be a gouged and green-glowing thing, immured for all eternity with these others. Great, tearing shrieks ripped from her pallid lips, shrieks that mounted and soared to the bursting point of madness. She dashed insanely from side to side, beating on the light-studded walls with bleeding hands. Her stumbling feet kicked against a phosphorescent corpse. They sank deep into moldy powder, ghastly dust that rose in a suffocating cloud. The solid-seeming thing her shoe had touched had disintegrated into nothingness. She jumped back, pressed her burning eyeballs with frantic fingers. Insanity knocked with peremptory summons at her brain. Her limbs twitched and her lips were a frozen orifice through which terror and madness went rocketing. A thump penetrated somehow to her shrieking senses. What was that? She whirled just in time to see a yawning hole in the wall, to see two figures come clumping through. Now surely, she was mad, even as Frank had been. Shrill laughter, more terrible than any scream, burbled from her lips. An insane husband and a maniac wife. What a perfect couple to roam the world together. She must find Frank and tell him of the jest. It rocked her sides and tore at her bones. Frank. She must go to him, tell him. If she were not mad, how could she have imagined these figures who stood motionless before her? First, a tomb of rock with a million glaring eyes, then corpses that flamed with a cold green fire, and crumbled into powder at her touch. Now these. They were huge, shapeless things with gray, amorphous sides and fingerless appendages, monstrous beasts that stared at her unblinkingly out of round, glassy eyes set in gray globes that served for heads. Motionless, sinister, appalling. Like metal monsters they seemed to Laura's half-mad mind, spawned in the bowels of the earth, soulless beings obedient only to the will of Satan. They stirred simultaneously into clanking movement. Their huge, hoof-like feet lifted, thumped down with metallic sound. Their dangling arms, gray and scaly, spread wide to engulf her. The screeching laughter died in Laura's throat. A cold wind stirred her hot, dry skin, shivered down her spine. The madness fled and terror took its place. The monsters were coming for her. Whimpering, she shrank back from their gelid embrace. On and on they came, with doomful, inexorable tread, the thump of their gray-shod feet loud in her ears. Back, ever back, forcing her closer and closer to the chrome-spangled rock, while the row of silent, green-tinged corpses grinned up at her with pockmarked laughter. Back, back, while her yielding feet stumbled and slid, and whimpers of fear grew to hopeless shrieks. The monsters did not seem to hear, their glazed eyes did not waver. Laura felt smooth rock press against her back. She had reached the limits of the cavern. Pain lanced suddenly through her flesh, 1,000 stinging arrows of fire. She swerved desperately away, just as a gray-skinned monster plucked with fingerless, shapeless hand for her body. She stopped short, whirled again. The other loomed in her path, blocking with metal body and terrifying head all escape. Moaning, she darted back and forth in short, frenzied runs while the gruesome pair slowly and undeniably closed in, as if intent to crush her frail body between their unyielding forms. An arm extended clumsily, swung around her slender waist. A baleful, unwinking sphere bent over her. Within that glassy eye, Laura sensed malignant hate, destroying lust. The touch of that whipping arm was icy hard to her quivering body. With a last despairing scream, Laura rebounded from the gelid contact. Blind, mad with terror, she lunged forward, low, like a wrestler. Her soft flesh smashed against a steel-hard leg, Karamed off in a sprawling dive that carried her under a down-clutching arm. She was free for the moment. But the monsters were already turning, slowly, clumsily. Strangled snarls of rage sounded in what might have been throats. They were coming for her again. Laura pushed her trembling limbs erect. Where, in this place of horror, was there safety from the underworld things? She shrank again from their thudding approach. This time they would get her, this time she could not escape. The breath seemed frozen in her lungs, her legs were flowing water. She could not continue to fight. For the last time, she glared wildly around at the circumscribing rock with its unholy sparkle. A gray monster lunged forward, just missing Laura as she leaped. But she had seen, and hope flared like a beacon light in her brain. Off to one side yawned round blackness. It was the opening in the stony wall through which the subterranean denizens had penetrated. What lay beyond she did not know, what dreadful horrors awaited her she did not pause to think. It was her only chance, and even now, as she hesitated, the farther creature seemed to read her thoughts. He quickened his clumsy gait. In another second, his metal form would be between her and the beckoning cavity. She pivoted on her heel and ran madly for the opening. Muffled howls crashed in her eardrums, then blackness swallowed her whole. Her feet raced across the stony ground, forced her panting form up and up what seemed an endless tunnel. Behind her, the thick murk was loud with the pounding noise of pursuit. Laura sped on, caroming off invisible walls, bruising her tender flesh against sudden projections, slipping, stumbling, sobbing, squeezing her tortured lungs for the last reserve ounce of energy. Then suddenly, the pursuing sound ceased, and she was alone, in solid darkness. She leaned against a damp, cold wall, all strength gone. For what seemed hours, she swayed against the supporting rock, waiting for her pounding heart to slow to normal action, for her blood to stop its mad mill race through her veins. And all the while, her every sense was straining, listening for sounds or signs that the monsters had caught up to her. But the strange, breathless silence continued. Were those gray denizens lurking back in the tunnel, blocking escape in that direction? Were they chuckling, even now, in those muffled, snarling tones of theirs, knowing that worse lay ahead for her, that soon she would rebound, desperately, madly, to welcome even their horror rather than what was at the end of the tunnel? But mercifully, she did not know. Slowly her limbs resumed their functioning, slowly her brain clicked back to a semblance of coherent thought. She must think clearly if she were ever to get out of this frightful place. Where was she? The enshrouding rock returned no answer, but she knew. The shadowy thing had attacked her at the base of Superstition Mountain. When she awoke from her drugged unconsciousness, she was in a cavern. Now she was in a tunnel of solid stone. That meant that somehow she had been carried into the very bowels of the granite upthrust, that even now, millions of tons of solid rock pressed down upon her. Laura repressed the shudder of fear that rippled over her. Evil things were happening within Superstition Mountain, macabre beings swarmed in its womb who seemed not of earth or its denizens. And Frank, her husband. A pang pierced her heart. Where was he? What was being done to him in his mind-clouded state? What dreadful use was being made of Himeyuro, of those other chained, bestial madmen who had clanked with bowed, brutish heads down the lumber path? She started up again, aching for her husband. She must find him. Somewhere ahead, in the darkling upward swing of this mountain boar, lay the Secreta Euro and Frank. She must be brave. She must not give way to that shrieking madness again. Either she would win, or a Euro, well, a Euro life meant nothing without the man she loved.